I will say, like, on the fire department, even in the time that I've been on, and I've only been in the fire service for like 9 years. So from the time that I've been on till now, the culture has changed. You know, 9 years ago, 10 years ago, it was very rare to hear people talk about their mental health, to hear people talk about some of the changes they may make at work in order to benefit their families. So like a good example is I went from the busiest station in the city last year to like a middle of the road kind of slow station because I wasn't sleeping at night and I was coming home grumpy. And I was like, I want to be the best dad I can be, the best husband I can be. If this means my reputation is ruined a little bit at work because I took a step to the slower station, I'm like, that's fine, because when I retire, the only people that are going to take care of me is my family. So
welcome to the Growth and Thriving podcast, where we celebrate those who have overcome great adversity and hardship and examine the tools by which people create lives for themselves that feel like thriving. Specifically, welcome to the first episode for the new year, 2022. I hope everyone had nice holidays. And I'm very excited about my guest today because we've been talking for a long time, months and months, about getting John onto this podcast. And we had one scheduled, and I think it was my fault. I had to reschedule. And and it's been a process. But what's interesting is typically when I have people on the podcast, it's either because they're a helping professional of some sort, like a therapist or personal trainer, and they talk about how they work with people, or I have somebody whose story I know, and I know about the difficulties and hardships that they've overcome to get to where they are. John is a firefighter in Colorado Springs and on the hazmat team there, but he is not traditionally what we think of as a helping professional. And I don't know a whole lot about his personal life, but through our friendship through jiu-jitsu, John just has a quality about himself that I knew that he needed to be a guest on this podcast. So husband, father, Colorado Springs firefighter, purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And by the way, like a beast of a purple belt, not a benign purple belt like me. Like
whatever. Thank you.
Purple belt in Jiu-Jitsu and a really good human being. And let me not forget, co-host of the Mentor podcast.
That's right.
It's a really exceptional podcast. If you haven't heard it, you should. It's excellent. Everybody, please welcome John Roy. John, thanks for coming on.
Of course. And I guess I'm excited to be the first episode for the new year. So thank you for that. I kind of mentioned to you before, I actually literally, while we were talking, I just got the results. I do have COVID. Oh. So, yep. So if I sound like I have a scratchy throat or I'm stopping to drink water, I apologize. But so a little bit about me. So I was born in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, which I don't remember at all. My dad was an officer in the Army. He actually went to West Point, and he was working at a recruiting station in Duluth, Minnesota, and we lived in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. So he would make the commute. Well, both my parents are from Colorado Springs, and they had family in Colorado Springs. So after a couple years there, my dad was like, you know what, they're doing a reduction in force. This was around the Gulf War time. So he took a reduction in force and ended up leaving and took a severance. And they moved back to Colorado Springs. Well, my dad and my mom didn't move here with any sort of plan. So they had like no job. In my younger years, like probably from the age of like 3 to maybe 5, we actually lived in a trailer park with my great grandma. Wow. And my dad worked for some like carbon monoxide detection company, and my mom worked at the Citadel Mall. So during the day, my great grandma would take care of my sister who has Down syndrome. And then a lady across the trailer park would take care of me. So first, exposure to Colorado Springs was less than glorious. My parents were definitely very poor. But my uncle was on the fire department here locally, and he said to my dad, he was like, "Hey, you should test for the fire department and the police department." My dad ended up getting hired for the police department, and then our financial situation kind of turned around. So
Mm.
from the time I was probably about 5 on, we were in District 20 schools. Like, it was a complete 180 from what
Right.
we were living in before. And my perception of my childhood up until about 12 or 13 was pretty good. You know, I had a favorable opinion of my childhood. I had great memories of my childhood. It got a little complicated though when my parents divorced when I was about 12 or 13 years old. So at that time, I ended up living with my mom pretty much full time. And like I mentioned, I have a sister with Down syndrome. So I was essentially kind of the man of the house for probably like 3 years, from the time I was about 12 to the time I was at 15. So essentially, what I would do is in the morning, I would get up, I'd make my sister breakfast, I'd walk her to middle school. Once middle school was over, I'd bring her home, I'd make her dinner, and around 7 o'clock, my mom would come home. So that was kind of my life for a couple years there after my parents divorced. Then when my mom met my stepdad, my life changed even more. Like, my mom was so, I think she was just inundated with working full time, having a daughter with Down syndrome. So to have a son who was able bodied, who could do what he wanted and come and go as he pleased, I had the longest leash in the world. I mean,
Yeah.
when I got my driver's license, I was like, on school nights, I'd be out till midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. And I never got that privilege taken away from me, though, because I was smart enough to know that if I wanted to keep a long leash, I had to make good decisions. So I'm not joking. I said, when I say that I've never even smoked marijuana, I mean, I was like a pretty straight and narrow kid. I mean, occasionally I probably drank when I was in high school, but overall, I had this huge leash and I kind of just did what I wanted. So after I graduated high school, I knew I wanted to work in public safety. But for anybody who knows about public safety, it's very competitive. So, especially the fire department.
Right.
At the time that I tested for the fire department, I think there were like 2,000 applicants and they hired 30 people. So I knew I had a little ways to go. Attended UCCS. That's where I met my wife when I was 18.
Mm.
Um, we were in two different phases of life. She grew up in a pastor's household. I obviously grew up with a really long leash, so we didn't necessarily meld at all. It took a long time to figure out how to kind of work together. But anyway, I worked real briefly at a couple different jobs. I was a mortgage specialist at Wells Fargo, and then in 2012, I tested for the fire department and I ended up getting hired. After I got hired on the fire department, I saw that that opportunity was kind of my time to dabble in a bunch of different things. So I finished my bachelor's degree from UCCS. Took me 7 years to do it.
Mhm.
I started teaching at Pikes Peak Community College in their fire science program. I was a deputy campaign manager for a local political campaign. We were trying
Well,
to get collective bargaining for firefighters.
mm.
So they sent me to Washington, D.C. to get training on how to run campaigns. That was a really cool experience. Um, and I worked for the private consulting company too, teaching fire service classes. And my mentality was, I'm going to do as much as I can before I have a daughter or a son or a child.
Right.
And then once my daughter's born, I was like, okay, I'm gonna scale things back and focus on her. And our daughter was born with, it's called intrauterine growth restriction.
Mhm.
So when she was born, they had no explanation of why. Because generally, when you have intrauterine growth restriction, it's because the mom has had bad habits, whether it's drugs or alcohol or whatever it may be. My wife's a labor and delivery nurse, so she obviously knew what to do with having a kid. So our daughter was 4 pounds 2 ounces when she was born. She dropped to 3 pounds 12 ounces in the hospital. So she was tiny. I mean, I could hold her in my hand. It was crazy, and we couldn't figure out why. Um, and they told us that it was probably genetic, which makes sense because the part that was not working was my wife's placenta. And they say that of all of the things that the male contributes in pregnancy, the placenta is generally what they contribute to, is building that placenta. Well, with my sister having Down syndrome, they actually did testing on me and my dad when I was younger. And we both had some genetic abnormalities. So I'm guessing that the reason my daughter was so small was because of that. But she's healthy now. My wife's healthy, works a part-time job at the hospital.
Mhm.
And right now, my biggest focus is my family getting really good at jujitsu,
Yeah.
and trying to maintain a level of professionalism at work, even though I'm not doing nearly as much as I used to.
Sure, sure. So how long did it take for your daughter to sort of, rebound from a difficult start?
It not very long. One of the things that's really interesting about babies when they're that small is they don't have any fat content.
Right.
And when they're born, they're very lethargic. So the most difficult time for us was actually probably in the first month of her being born, because essentially what we had to do to feed her was we had to unswaddle her and get her cold to
Mhm.
wake her up. She
Right.
was stimulated enough to eat, but you couldn't keep her cold for too long because then her blood sugar would drop. So that was difficult, but honestly, like, I can't believe how healthy she is given the circumstances, because they told us, they're like, she could have physical disabilities, she could have mental disabilities, and she really has had none of that. But having that experience has ultimately led us to decide that we're only going to have one child.
Mhm. Mhm. And she's how old now?
She's 3.5.
3.5.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, wow, quite an adventure.
Yeah. 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 Unique experiences all around for sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I'm wondering with some of the things. So and this is actually who I know you to be, right? Like you talk through things very kind of like factually, right? These are
Yeah.
the things that happened, and I imagine some of them were more difficult, some of them were less difficult, right?
Yeah.
Some more,
Yep.
um, I can say that for an adolescent with a long leash, it's probably atypical to have judgment as good as yours was. Like,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and required some restraint. So I guess I'm wondering a little bit about like some of your like your coping mechanisms and where you think your resilience comes from, and maybe if there are things you do specifically to try to maintain that resilience. And
Yeah. Well, as a kid, I don't know that I really had a lot of coping mechanisms. I can distinctly remember before I could drive and when I was kind of the man of the house, any opportunity I had to go and escape to my room, I would. If I had the opportunity to go and be in my room and play video games or watch movies or whatever, I would be in there for 12 or 13 hours. I just wanted to be left alone. Not to mention, like, my mom, and I'm going to be very careful with how I say this because my mom actually listened to one of my podcast episodes and she wasn't very happy with how I articulated this. But my mom had a ton of really good qualities. She was very generous. She took care of us. In Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there was never a need that wasn't met.
right.
With that being said, she was under a lot of stress too. So there were times where she either got very verbally abusive with me or physically abusive. So a lot of that escape mechanism was me just kind of trying to hide from my mom.
Mhm.
When I got older, I think probably my biggest coping mechanism was sports.
Right.
I played football. I did wrestling. Wrestling was by far one of the hardest things I've ever done. But honestly, when I think about my adulthood, there is like one defining moment in my life where I feel like I built resiliency. So to kind of talk about the fire department a little bit, I got hired when I was 20 years old.
Wow.
So most people don't realize this, and I'm not trying to like blow this out of proportion, but there is a lot of death and tragedy that happens in a
Yes.
big city like Colorado Springs, right? So it's not an understatement to say that once every week or two, we are seeing somebody who's died,
Yeah.
or we're seeing trauma, right? So when I was 20, I just really didn't. I would watch these guys who would just shrug it off as if like we didn't just see the things that we did. And it wasn't until I was 23 years old that I read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations.
Mhm.
So, for those who don't yet know, Marcus Aurelius is kind of one of the founding fathers of the Stoic philosophy. And basically, like when people hear the word Stoic, they think that it's somebody who's devoid of emotion. When in reality, Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, their whole mentality was you have control over your own mind. You don't have control over everything else that happens to you outside events.
External events, right? Yeah.
Right, right. Internal versus external locus of control.
Mhm.
Right. So I read Meditations, but there was one quote that really stood out to me, and it's kind of been a guiding principle for me since then. And he said, "You have the power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you'll find strength."
Mhm.
So as I reflected on my childhood, as I reflected on some of the bad things that had happened to me or continued to happen to me, I realized that there was nothing I could really do to change that. And how I would cope with that was essentially to kind of work through my own thoughts and feelings. And like you talked about it being matter of fact, like as I've reflected more on my experience, to me, it is kind of matter of fact now. Like that happened,
Mhm.
but it doesn't have to define me now.
Right.
So that was a defining moment for me as far as resiliency. And then honestly, probably the next big thing in life that's built resiliency is jujitsu.
Yeah.
I firmly believe that people oftentimes try to build happiness in their life by buying things or having possessions, when in reality, I feel like in order to find true happiness, you have to have some sort of healthy struggle, is what I call it, because that's kind of what life is sometimes, and
Sure. Yeah.
jujitsu has been that for me. It's been my healthy struggle. It's kept me focused on a task. It's been a mental and physical benefit, but it's also been a psychological benefit too. I mean, we have a huge group of people who have substance abuse issues in the fire service, and I wish that more people in public safety were introduced to jujitsu because it's been life changing for me.
Yeah. I think, um, it's probably not coincidence that in language, right, when we talk about dealing with difficulties or hardships, we use phrases like wrestling with them or grappling,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Um, I don't think that's coincidence.
Hmm.
To me, grappling has all the benefits you said. It also, I think, is a great way to build mindfulness, right?
Hmm.
Because
For sure.
right when I've got somebody your size on my back trying to choke me unconscious, I'm not worried about what I'm doing tomorrow,
Yeah,
right?
that's a
And I'm
great point.
certainly not ruining the past, right? Like I'm
Yeah.
in the moment trying to
Right.
survive.
Right.
And I think that's part of the reason why I have a phenomenon a lot of times where I have to really talk myself into getting there
Mm.
because I just don't know if my ego can take another 2 hours of beating. Um, but I never leave unhappy,
Right.
ever,
Right.
ever. I've never and my story with jujitsu is a little bit weird because I started in the late 90s.
Mm.
Um, and I was living in New Jersey and I had to drive an hour to train. But then I moved around for graduate school and I went to Indiana and I
Mm.
went to Illinois and there was no jujitsu anywhere.
Yeah, it
So
wasn't
I had
established then, right?
years, right. So I had
Yeah.
years of not training and
Right.
then came back to it much later.
Yeah.
But yeah, in all those years, I've never left a jiu even in the rare occasion where I've gotten injured or something, I've
Right.
still never left a class being like, man, I wish I didn't come tonight.
Right. Right.
Ever.
Yeah. No,
You know?
that's a great point, and that's why I continue to do it to this day. I mean, it's it's part of my schedule. Like I schedule a lot of things around jujitsu because I know how beneficial it is for me, and I'm fortunate too because my wife is very supportive of jujitsu. I think that a lot of spouses could look at it and say, "Well, this is a huge time commitment. You're spending, 2 hours every day you have off away from us, away from the family." But my wife realizes that it's a healthy addiction for me, and the alternative is I could be drinking alcohol or worse, doing drugs. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
she gets it.
Yeah. If I get grumpy enough, I get kicked out to go ride my motorcycle or go to jiu-jitsu. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Um, so when you talk about stoicism, that struck me because um, so I'll start by saying I'm actually a big fan of stoicism and
Hmm.
I think it has a lot of value to offer. My experience with stoicism is I've probably met, I don't know, several hundred people who claim to follow stoicism.
Hmm.
And of that several hundred, maybe 2 dozen do
Actually do.
it, will do it what I would consider well.
Yeah.
So if you would, the quote from Marcus Aurelius again, if you have
Yes.
control over your mind, right?
Yep. So you have power over your mind, not
Mhm.
outside events. Realize this and you'll find strength.
Right. So in my experience, there's hundreds and hundreds of people, probably thousands or more, who feel like when things happen, they ignore it, right? They push it aside and don't deal with it in the name
Mm.
of stoicism.
Stuff and
And,
avoid.
right.
Right.
And
Right.
right. And to me, that's like, it's like not treating a wound, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just going to fester. But you said the key thing, which I think many, like the majority of people fail to do, which is I work through all my thoughts and feelings.
Yes.
Right. I think Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus would have said that your emotions are very real and very
Yes.
important. They're
For
just
sure.
they're just terrible masters. You
Yes.
don't want them running the show,
Yes.
right? But you have to deal with them.
Yeah.
And so I think what happens a lot of times is the people who do turn to drugs or alcohol or promiscuity, and these are not, by the way, these are not value judgments on those
Right.
people. It's
Right.
just pretty well known that most frequently people who turn to substances or sex or gambling or anything that gives you an immediate dopamine rush, um, it's usually to try to cover up trauma or hardship or difficulty that's been stuffed for so long that it's just erupting out of them now.
Right. Right. No, that makes perfect sense. And I have a couple thoughts on that. I mean, first of
Yeah.
all, if you think about what meditations is,
Right.
it's essentially Marcus Aurelius journaling all of his thoughts and feelings about the world and how our minds work. But I would say that I've learned over the years that it really is important to have a sounding board and someone that you trust. And one of the things that I'm really fortunate about is my wife, having worked in healthcare, is very receptive to having conversations about what I've seen, what I've done, and you'll have a lot of guys on the fire department who would never tell their spouse some of the things that they see, would
Yeah.
never tell their spouse, some of their worst calls or, how those calls made them feel.
Right.
And for me, I've always tried to just be an open book with my wife because it's like you said, I can't afford to hold on to those things. If I want to have control over my mind the way that I think that I do, I have to let those things go.
Yeah. Yeah. What's ironic to me also is in my experience. So I always say in my experience, because I don't have data to support this, right? Like there's some things I'll say and it's like, well, this has been studied and researched. And so we have some confidence in it. What I'm about to say,
Mm-hmm.
I don't, maybe probably hasn't been studied. I don't know, but I don't have any data. It's just my experience anecdotally.
Right.
But, I spent 7 years as an active duty military psychologist. And
Mm-hmm.
what my sort of non-scientific observation is that the baddest, excuse my language, but the baddest motherfuckers, like the Green Berets, the Navy
Yeah.
SEALs,
Yeah.
all those guys, the oh god, the in the Air Force, the weather guys, that's
PJs,
Special Forces,
CCT, those dudes.
PJs,
Yeah.
yeah. So EOD, right?
Mm-hmm.
All those guys, that's Bomb Squad, right? EOD. Those dudes would come in and make pretty good use of therapy usually.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
would open up and they would spill out all the puzzle pieces and turn them right side up and try to put them in order.
Yep.
And it was much harder working with the folks who were not what we would think of as operators.
Yeah.
Right. So the folks who were, I don't know, in force support, or in, personnel, or in, that sort of thing, where in garrison at home, they had an office job, right? IT folks, at home, they're not going to the range. They're not running,
Right.
operational tactical drills every day. They're sitting at a desk, and as was I, right? I was doing that too. But then they get deployed and they'd see some of the things you're talking about,
Yeah.
right? When you get deployed, everybody's a combatant except for the medics and the chaplains. And so, they'd go and they'd see mangled bodies and they'd see death and they'd come home and try to stuff it and try to, and start to kind of fall apart.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, for sure. And actually, it's interesting that you bring up the operators because one of the people that I look up to the most is his name's Andy Stumpf. He used to be a Navy SEAL. I think he was on SEAL Team 6. But anyway, he has a podcast. And one of the things that he reiterates over and over and over again is the importance of therapy, the importance of seeking even if it's not formal therapy, but just getting those things off your chest, talking about those things. And I think that having people like him put that message out there makes other people more willing to do that sort of thing. Because, historically it's like, and my dad was this way. It was like machismo, you know what I mean? Like it was like, no, I don't have any psychological issues. All the things that I've seen, they don't mess me up.
Right.
I remember when I was a kid, my dad was involved in a shooting here locally, and he ended up killing a suspect and never talked about it. Like never, at least not that I saw,
Right.
So I think it's a generational, it's starting to become a generational change too.
I think so. I think so. And I would say that, that old school sort of like you get involved in something like that, which like, listen, I've, again, as a therapist, I'm not an operator. I'm not a badass, right? Like I was in the military, but I didn't carry a weapon. I was a doc. But I had a patient for a while who was formerly on SEAL Team 6.
Mm.
And, you know, he would say, like, as far as he knew, he didn't have any questionable kills, right? Like every kill that he's responsible for was
Justified.
authorized and justified, right? And so nothing that he looks back and regrets or feels like it was a mistake. Yet, like this guy, when I was seeing him working with him, he was approaching retirement, and he was like, "Yeah, I don't even hunt anymore." He's like, "If I never kill another living thing, I'll be just fine."
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so there's impact.
Mm-hmm.
And in my opinion, like somebody like your dad had a great opportunity that was missed.
Yeah.
Right? Because not only could he have maybe benefited himself, but he could have modeled for you
Right.
what it looks like
Totally.
to work through
Yeah.
hard things,
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
And in our generation, I don't know if you have this experience. I have it all the time with my kids. I want to model it for them, and I want to show them what it looks like.
Yeah.
And I do try anyway, and I let them know that I go to therapy and so on and so forth, and that I have a counselor. But there's a moment when I go to initiate those conversations where like the way I was raised jumps up from it, and I get this like knot in my stomach for a moment.
Yeah.
I have to push it aside and press on for their benefit,
Right.
Is
Right.
that something
Right.
you experience with this, like being caught between the two generations?
I mean, obviously my daughter is so young.
Yeah.
But what I will say is like we talk to her about her feelings all the time. Like basically, we have a book that it's like the color book, and it talks about the
Oh, yeah.
different feelings that you can express and feel. And we encourage her to express her feelings and talk about how she's feeling, with the emphasis of it's okay to feel the way that you're feeling. Just make sure that you're not taking out your anger or frustration on other people.
Right.
So we have some practices put in place there. But I will say, like, on the fire department, even in the time that I've been on, and I've only been in the fire service for like 9 years. So from the time that I've been on till now, the culture has changed. 9 years ago, 10 years ago, it was very rare to hear people talk about their mental health, to hear people talk about some of the changes they may make at work in order to benefit their families. So like a good example is I went from the busiest station in the city last year to like a middle of the road kind of slow station because I wasn't sleeping at night and I was coming home grumpy, and I was like, I want to be the best dad I can be, the best husband I can be. If this means my reputation is ruined a little bit at work because I took a step to the slower station, I'm like, that's fine, because when I retire, the only people that are going to take care of me is my family. So
Right.
anyway, culturally though, it's much more accepting. I think that now you have guys and gals who are having open conversations about, man, this really jacked me up, or man, spending time there really, really didn't do very good things for my family. This is why I made this change. So I'm happy to see that in a profession like the fire service, people are having those conversations, but then I'm also happy that generationally we are having those conversations with our kids as well.
Mhm.
For me personally, I think the hard balance for me is, how do I teach my daughter that it's okay to acknowledge your thoughts and feelings and emotions? But then how do I also teach her to be strong, independent, resilient, because I could easily see the pendulum swinging the opposite way, where we're so cognizant of our thoughts and feelings and emotions that we're crippled by them, so that's the balance that I think that's going to be difficult as my daughter gets older to try to find.
Yeah. Yeah, I can relate to that. Not so I'm a big believer that you can't be resilient if you don't really understand your thoughts and feelings, and right.
Yes, I agree.
Um, however, the execution of how you download that right for your
Yeah,
children
for sure.
is a different piece, right? Um, and that's those are the moments that are tough, because we have to be able to do it in order to show them what it looks like. And that's when I'm feeling angry or frustrated or overwhelmed, how do I validate that it's real? Take a breath, like, recognize, don't ignore it, recognize that it's
Yeah,
real,
right.
and choose to function in a way that keeps my cool or is appropriate
Yeah,
for the circumstance. Or
yeah,
yes,
yeah,
right,
for sure.
yeah. And I don't, I think there's lots of people who have lots of great answers, but kids are little people. There's a lot of diversity. They're all
Oh, for
different.
sure.
Parents are
For
all
sure.
different. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Um, I had I think I can only imagine. I have boys, so I can only imagine that with a girl, you know, the question of how do you make her strong and resilient is prominent, because culture is going to teach her not to be.
Right. For
Society is
sure.
going to teach her
For sure.
to be a damsel in distress, right?
Yeah.
So my thing was with boys, how do I teach them to also be strong and resilient, which society will expect of them,
Right.
but with compassion and empathy
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
emotional intelligence, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great point. And actually, kind of going back to the jujitsu conversation, I'm not trying to imply that jujitsu is kind of the the answer for everything, but my wife and I have had that conversation of like, when my daughter's old enough, we're going to try to introduce her to jujitsu.
Yeah.
My wife doesn't currently do jujitsu, but she said, when that time comes, she's going to do it too, because she wants to set that example for our daughter that
Yeah.
this is a good thing. It's a healthy thing. It's a way to defend yourself, but it's all the other benefits that we talked about before. So fingers crossed when that time comes, hopefully my daughter will enjoy jujitsu.
Yeah.
I think that she'll be exposed to it enough through me and my wife, hopefully, that it'll kind of just happen naturally. I don't intend to really push it hard on her, but I could easily see that, especially with a girl, being that balance between still being a girl, but having the tools to be resilient and having the tools to not be the damsel in distress.
Yeah. Yeah. And don't get me wrong. I mean, in my opinion, a girl can be, I mean, there's girls getting through Ranger school
Oh,
and
for sure.
through Marine recon school.
Yeah.
And so there's no doubt that girls can be tough, right? The issue is, that society is going to, like, the girls who do choose to be tough or have some masculine qualities, kind of, not always maybe, but sort of pay a price for it socially, you know and
Yeah.
so
No, you're right.
the issue is, how do we encourage them to be who they want to be,
Right.
even
Right.
if there's a social cost, and
Right.
to balance, you know maybe some femininity or some more traditionally feminine qualities with this inner strength and resilience to take care of herself when she needs to,
Right.
boundaries,
Right.
and enforce them, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do a lot of thinking about parenting.
Mhm. You and I both. Yeah, it's a daily struggle,
Yeah.
and like people, that classic saying where people are like, it's the best thing and the worst thing all at the same time.
Yeah.
You don't really understand that until you have kids,
Right.
and then once you do, you're like, okay, I totally get this, because I could be so frustrated with something that my daughter's done, And then
Yeah.
5 minutes later, she's giving me a hug, and it's like I've totally forgotten what I was even frustrated about in the first place, you know? So yeah, it's interesting, you know, and I didn't have, I had okay, I would say okay. Well, I don't even want to say that. That's not really a nice way of saying it, but I had some strained relationship with my parents. I still do, you know? So that's
You and me
another thing
both.
that I try. Yeah. And that's another thing I try to take into account when I'm parenting my daughter is how do I take all of the lessons that my parents taught me, even if they were not necessarily good lessons. Like I just don't like the way they treated me. I don't like the way that they acted. How do
Yep.
I recall that and then apply that to trying to be a good parent now?
Right. So I can tell you how not to do that because I've screwed it up. um,
I'm interested. I'm all ears.
so my relationship with my folks sounds a little bit more tenuous than yours. I grew up with a lot of violence and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
violence, verbal abuse, um, and a lot of physical violence. And my dad is historically an incredibly short fuse, and when it goes, boy, it goes.
Mm-hmm.
And screaming and yelling and cursing and name calling, and and when I first got married, I'm divorced now, but when I first got married and had kids, I knew I didn't want to be like that.
Right.
And so here's the mistake I made. When I came up upon, when things are going well, it's really easy. When I would come upon circumstances that were more difficult, when my kids needed discipline or when my then spouse and I were disagreeing on something,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I had in my mind how my dad would react to it, and I would try to do the opposite.
Mm.
And that went miserably. It never worked well, ever.
Mm.
And it took me a while. It took me, 2 years, 3 years, something like that, to recognize that on some level, doing the opposite of him is very similar to doing exactly like him, because he's still governing my behavior.
Yeah, no,
Right?
that's a great point.
Yeah. Like doing the opposite of him is not being who I want to be.
Right, right. No,
Right?
that's an excellent point. That's an excellent point. I think some of the biggest takeaways for me so far is not necessarily like how specifically did my dad act in this scenario or my mom, but there's like some ground rules. Like the first ground rule for me is there's no physical violence.
Yeah.
You know, like I'm not going to lay a hand on my daughter. The second ground rule is I'm going to do my best to not raise my voice.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to cuss at her.
Right.
And then the third one is I'm going to tell her I love her as much as I can,
Yeah.
because that was something that my parents very rarely did. You know,
Mhm.
and I know how important that is for especially a developing kid to
Yeah.
hear that their parents love them and are proud of them. So if anything, it's not necessarily reflecting on specific events, but it's more here are the ground rules that I'm going to try to abide by because I've seen the opposite.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, that's very different from what I did in the beginning, because, what you've done is taken situations that you don't like and say, okay, how do I want to approach them?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And again, you'll probably find as she gets a little older that knowing what you're not going to do is a good start.
Yeah.
There's then the follow-up question of what are you going
What
to
are
do?
you going to do? Yeah. No,
And
that's a great point.
well, and here's the tricky part, I think, is the things you're not going to do, those are things you're not going to do for the rest of her life.
Right.
The things you are going to do are going to have to change as she grows and develops,
Yes.
partially because her needs will be different, and
Right.
partially because she'll figure out how to shut down what you are
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah. No, that's
So,
she's already doing that. So
yeah,
it's
right.
it's a constant. I'm constantly having to try to evolve as a parent to
Yeah,
meet the needs of and try to be an effective parent with how quickly she's changing. You know.
no,
So.
right. Yeah, I was lucky to have gone to graduate school and study psychology and human development before I became a parent. Um, the the there's a study that sticks out in my mind as like the most important like parenting guidance that I ever received. Um, there were these researchers who took, I don't know how many, few hundred participants or whatever, kids, and they split them in groups where based on their mother's parenting style. This was back in the days when dads didn't really parent much, and so it was all the research was on mothers. But they measured the mother's parenting style on two domains. There was warmth and there was demand. So warmth is exactly what you're talking about. How much do you say I love you? How much do you hug them, sit them on your lap? If they're a little older, do you horseplay with them? Do you have physical kind of right? Demand is discipline. It's, do they have chores that they have to do? Do you force them to do their homework and make sure they get good grades? Do you, right?
Right.
You have consequences when they don't do the things that they're supposed to do. And so obviously there's 8 different groups because you can be high or low on each domain. So you could be high in warmth, low in demand, high in demand, low in warmth, right? And so on and so forth. And they followed these kids until they were 30, like for a couple of decades, to see how they did as adults. And the kids who did the best as adults, who were the most well-adjusted, had the greatest life satisfaction, had the healthiest relationships, were kids whose parents were high in warmth and high in demand.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. What's most interesting to me is the kids who did the absolute worst as adults had parents who are high in warmth and low in demand. Right? So here's the crazy part. The kids who had parents who were low in both, so basically ignored them.
Yeah.
Still did better.
Which is kind of a testament to who I was, especially as a teenager. Like my leash was so long. My mom, I really wasn't telling me to do anything, So I get it. I mean, that's a great point. And actually, my wife's going to love listening to this, because I would say one of my biggest weaknesses as a parent is the demand portion.
Right.
My wife is very good at warmth, but also demand.
Right.
That's probably my number one thing that I could work on as a parent, is that demand. I am constantly, my wife should be doing as a unit. I think I'm like the very stereotypical dad that's like totally melted by the fact that I have such a cute little daughter. You know what I mean? So that's a weakness of mine that I need to improve on for sure.
Yeah. I've got plenty of things I need to work on too. It's funny. I say this, like I wrote a doctoral dissertation on fatherhood, right? I'm being a father, and conducted research, and did a study on fatherhood. And I was referred to, I would not call myself this, but I was referred to as a fatherhood expert. And I got to tell you, if you were a fly on the wall in my house most days, you see expert parenting.
Right. Yeah.
You see me hanging on by a very thin thread.
I think that's just being a parent, Yep. Yeah.
And it's amazing. You could go off and be a firefighter, and are you paramedic as well, or?
No, so we have our rank structure is firefighter, and then there's paramedic and driver, and then company officer, and then chief officer. So I'm a driver.
Okay.
Yep.
So driver on the hazmat team, dealing with all kinds of crazy situations, right? And then you come home to this miniature version of yourself, and it just cripples you, like.
Totally. Well, and the person that I am at work, I mean, I'm sure if you were to ask my coworkers, or just expose my coworkers to who I am when I'm with my daughter and as a dad, they'd be like, wow, this is a totally different person. Because at work, we're in a professional environment. When people call us, we're expected to be the ones who have a level head and are cool and collected, and but when you're a parent, it's a struggle. And like I said, as a dad of a daughter, I think if I had a boy, I would be much more acclimated to the demand side, but something
Right.
about having a daughter is so much harder to want to discipline her, or so yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and you bring up another point, right? If you had a son, you'd be more acclimated to the demand side. One of the really hard things for me to do, one of the things, so when I finally realized that doing the opposite of what I went through is not me being who I want to be, right? And so I sat down and tried to really figure out, like, how do I want to parent? And one of the things that I try not to do, which I find so far, I find it impossible to not do it, but I sort of can do it less than I used to, if it makes sense,
Mm-hmm.
is to not impose my experience on them in any kind of
Mm-hmm.
way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if they want to do something and I'm kind of like, I don't know. And then I'm like, well, when I was 11, it's like, no, that's the wrong
Now you got to
rationale.
learn the consequences. Yeah.
It's not only that, but like the world is a different place, right? I have to make the
Oh,
decision.
totally.
Yeah. Even if it's just something they want to do, like go out and with friends and without me. And they're at the age where they're starting to do that kind of thing, just beginning to. And so I still scrutinize I let them go sometimes, but I scrutinize. And it's like, well, my 11-year-old, I just this year got him a cell phone. So if he goes out and has a problem, he can call me.
Right.
Couldn't do that when I was 11, right?
Right.
The world's
Right.
different.
Sure.
And so I have to make the decisions based on who they are, based on who I am, and based on what the world is like. And if I go back to 1984 when I was 11, it's a very different situation,
Even the 90s, I mean, playing outside and being out in the neighborhood, it wasn't like you were really worried, like we as kids could go multiple blocks away and our parents would never worry about it. But now that's probably another thing that I can work on is, in my profession, we see the worst of society.
Yes.
So I'm like conditioned in my mind to think that the world can be this really bad place, which it can, but
Right.
my exposure to it is so much higher than most people.
Right.
So how do I find that balance of, and I'm still, this is something I'm going to have to kind of cross that bridge when I get there, because obviously my daughter's so young, but how do I have a realistic view of what the world is and
Right.
still allow my daughter to have some freedoms and learn some of those things for herself?
And you say yours and maybe mine too, being a psychologist and hearing about,
Right.
I tend to deal with the victims of terrible things a lot,
Yeah.
but it skews your view on the world and it makes you feel like the world, and you say even more so than most people. And I would argue that in 2022, most people have more of a negativity bias than people did in 1984 or 1994 because
Yeah.
of our
I could see that.
access to information, because of the internet, right?
Right. Right.
Um, there was another study done a few years ago where they asked people if they thought there had been, like, school shootings had been increasing in frequency or decreasing. And unanimously, everyone, hundreds of people said, oh yeah, there's way more of them. And there weren't. They
Yeah.
were, it's just that it used to be we didn't hear about them all.
Right. Right. Well, and that's another thing that I've thought about too, is in reality, despite what you might read on Facebook or in the media, the world that we live in now, in terms of safety, is far safer than probably any time in human history. I mean,
Yeah,
you
for
think about,
sure.
we only have this perspective of an industrialized world,
Right.
and that's what we're basing our frame of reference on. But I mean, hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, people were savages,
Right.
so we probably live in a safer world than we ever have.
Yeah.
It's just, like you said, people's bias.
Well,
I would say the media is obviously a contributing factor, and then our own personal experiences.
yeah. I mean, if a kid was abducted in, Des Moines, Iowa in 1984 when I was 11, we probably would have never heard about it.
Right.
You turn on the nightly news and you get what was happening around the world, right? If there was a war or whatever, and you would get what was happening in your neighborhood. And that was it.
Yeah.
Now with the media, with the internet, and you can hear these, things from everywhere. And so it makes it seem like the frequency is much greater when it's really
Yeah.
not. Yeah.
Well, in 24-hour news, one of my
Yeah.
favorite comedians, Norm Macdonald, has a joke about when he was a kid, the news was half a hour. And
Right.
it turns out the amount of information that was going on in the world, half an hour about did it.
Yeah.
But now we've got this 24-hour news cycle. So I think that's a big part of it too.
Yeah, I agree. And so that's another piece of like what I try to do, like to build resilience in my kids, right? Is I try to, you know, um, I try to pair sort of like having real conversations with them about these sorts of things about, because they're on YouTube and they're not on Facebook yet, but
Right.
they're on YouTube and they have phones and they have computers. And so we talk about it and they hear about things like TikTok challenges and whatnot.
Right. Right.
Um, but I also like force them to like shut stuff off and go play outside.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like go get on your bikes. I don't want to see you for an hour.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great.
yeah. And so, and sometimes they look at me funny, because I don't
Yeah.
think all their friends, we've gotten so afraid. Everybody wants to keep their kids real
Oh,
close.
I know. Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm not sure we're doing them favors that way. I think it cripples them a little bit.
I think I'm with you. I feel really bad for kids who are living in this current generation. And more what I mean is with the pandemic. I mean, I think back to when I was in high school and it was like, those are some of the best years of my life. I know some people don't have that same experience, but like the ability to just be carefree and drive my car around and hang out with friends and play football and do all this stuff. It was awesome. Some of the fondest memories of my life. And then now you've got, kids who maybe didn't even have a graduation.
Right.
School sports were canceled, activities were canceled. I mean, that's a big deal to
Yeah.
kids at that time of their life.
Not only that, you've got in some areas, I mean, I haven't seen this personally, but you've got people calling the police if kids get together to play some like
Right.
or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a bizarre kind of circumstance and it is really unfortunate,
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
So yeah, I hear you. And the other piece that's really difficult, and I don't know what was different when we were kids of people's perspectives, but the truth is, bad things do happen. Like
Hmm.
that's the world, And if
Yep.
I send my kids out to play, something could happen. They could get hit by a car, or
Right.
God forbid, abducted, or and I don't know. I attribute it for me anyway. I lost, my mother died when I was 7,
Mm.
and so I learned at a very early age that like like you're not special. Like the universe just doesn't care, right? Bad
Right.
things happen, and um, and I remember the moment I learned this lesson was at the funeral because my mother died in the summer. It was July, and we're at the funeral, and the cemetery was in New Jersey, and it's right. If you've ever been to New Jersey, if you haven't, don't go. But
I've been in Newark, but
yeah, this was a little bit like that area.
okay.
And so the Garden State Parkway, which is a major highway,
Yep.
is right like there's a hill and the cemetery is at the top of the hill. Bottom of the hill is the Parkway, Garden State Parkway. And so I'm standing there, 7 years old in my little suit and tie, and we're having this funeral, and it's like the sun is shining and the skies are bright blue, and there's businesses across the street from the cemetery that are starting to pull up those metal gates in front and open up for business, and
Right.
the parkway is just full of cars that are on their way to work in the morning or whatever.
Yeah.
And they're lowering the casket into the ground, and I very clearly remember thinking to myself, like, the fuck is everybody doing? Like, don't they know what's going on here?
Right.
And I had to come to grips with like the fact that, what? Like, my mother died in 1981. So that's 41 years ago.
Yeah.
And every day the world has continued to turn and continued to spin, and everything went on regardless. And so, I have to recognize that. I guess what I'm saying is there's risk in everything, right? So if I send my kids out to play, there's risk.
Yes.
But if I keep them inside and don't let them experience the world at all, they may not get hit by a car and they may not get abducted by a stranger and they may not, but there's other risks associated with that.
Yes. Yes.
I don't know how to live in
Yes.
the world. Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think that the pandemic really kind of brings that to light. I mean, for me, this is so I've been exposed to COVID. I mean, I
In
don't
your
know.
line of work,
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, all the time. You know what I mean? This is the first time that I'm getting COVID.
Right.
So, I could have easily, like in the beginning of the pandemic, said, well, I need to look for another career field because I don't want to be exposed to this novel pathogen that we're dealing with right now. But that's just not, and I'm not discrediting people who have serious immune issues or elderly or whatever.
Sure.
But for somebody like myself who's young and has a family, I'm like, I can't just put my life on pause for 2 years.
Right.
And I think that applies across a lot of spectrums. It's like people are scared. It could be abductions, it could be just the world we live in, but people are scared to get out and just live life, and it's really unfortunate because time is the only resource we can't get back.
Right. I mean, that's the old cliche, right? Is everyone dies, but not everyone really lives.
Right. Right.
And again, if you go out to like work out, right? If you're running, there's risk. You could roll your ankle. You could, if you're lifting weights, you could throw your back out. If you go to jujitsu, you get injured, right? But if you don't work out, there's risks with that too. They're a little bit slower, a little more, they creep a little slower, but they catch up to you eventually,
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a conversation that I've actually had with Marcelo before because, he's done jujitsu for so long.
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, your body has to just hurt. And he was like, basically what he said was, I know that my heart is healthy. I know that my body is healthy. I might have aches and pains because of all the things that I do.
Right.
But in the long run, I'm going to outlive somebody who never takes risks and never lives life. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the case in several domains. If you work out or do a martial art or something, the risk is injury. If you don't, the risk is chronic illness, right? If you,
right,
have a social life and you fall in love, the risk is a broken heart. If you don't, the risk is isolation, right?
Loneliness,
yeah, right. And so, so it's a question of, it reminds me of a poster I've seen in the doctor's office that says like, exercise is hard, dieting is hard, drinking enough water is hard, getting enough sleep is hard, being obese is hard, having diabetes is hard, taking your medication is hard.
Right.
So choose which hard you want,
Well, and my thing has been life is hard, right?
Yeah.
So life is already hard.
Yeah.
So I might as well get a reward out of it.
Right.
If my life is already going to be struggle and my life is going to be difficult, I might as well do something that's fulfilling to me, like jujitsu.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And all sorts of other things, right? And jujitsu and travel and eat good food and,
right.
And have a fulfilling relationship.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
All those things.
Yeah.
One of the things that I end up talking to people a lot, when I was a therapist, I had this conversation a lot. Now that I'm not working in therapy anymore, but doing some coaching, I still have this conversation a lot. And it's like, if you want to know what the difference is between people who are generally, I'm not talking about moment to moment happiness, right? Because if you find out you won the lottery today, you'll have some happiness, right? If you go outside and somebody, backed into your car, you'll have some unhappiness.
Right.
So I'm not talking about circumstances, but overall general happier people versus less happy people, right? If you line up their timelines of their life, they both have, periods of awful things happening. They both have periods of grief, of trauma, of upset, of, whatever.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, the way the universe works is it doesn't really give you periods of great joy. It gives you periods of nothing.
Yeah.
In between those awful periods, right?
Yeah.
And the difference is that the people who are more happy do what they need to do to create meaning and find fulfillment in those flat periods,
Lulls. Yeah.
right? In those lulls. The people who are less happy are afraid to do something that's going to make them happy because they're afraid the other shoe's going to drop. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, yeah, it's
Yeah.
absolutely going to drop, but make yourself
Right.
happy in the interim, you know?
Right. Right. Yeah. And ultimately, we're all going to die someday.
For
So,
sure.
yeah, you might as well try to do whatever fulfills you,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would call that sort of the crux of like growth and thriving, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I think I going back to that Cleared Hot podcast I was talking about with that Navy SEAL, he does like a Q&A every week. And he had a guy who called in who said, I've got this perfect job. I've got a great wife, kids. I've got all the toys I could ask for,
Yeah.
but I'm not happy. And this guy's response to him was, well, you're not doing anything that, first of all, creates a struggle, like I talked about before, but second of all, that fulfills you.
Right.
You can buy all the material things in the world,
Yeah.
but you have to do something that fulfills you.
Yeah. I think that those things are completely accurate. And I think the value of struggle, by the way, it may seem like a paradox to some people, like how can you be happy through struggle? But in the way I understand it, and there may be other explanations, I'm not saying this is the only explanation, but is that through struggle is how you learn the capacities of your ability, right?
Right.
Through struggle, you encounter things and you think, oh, there's no way I can handle this, or there's no way.
Mm-hmm.
And you become more self-efficacious by doing things you didn't think you could.
Yeah.
Now, I'm a firm believer that having faith in your own ability to function creates greater life satisfaction.
Yeah, for
So,
sure.
so I think that's the mechanism. But I think there's one other element because, um, and maybe the terminology is different. Maybe, I don't know, there's contentment versus happiness or satisfaction. But when I was back in New Jersey and I was working as a personal trainer, I was in Princeton, which is a very, very wealthy area, right?
Yeah.
Albert Einstein taught at Princeton University, right? And
Mm.
lots of Hollywood people. And so a lot of money in Princeton. And so a lot of my clientele would go on vacation to this health and fitness resort in Massachusetts called Canyon Ranch.
Mm.
And they would always go there. And I would never, whatever, I'm like a blue collar kid. I grew up in the less wealthy areas of New Jersey.
Yeah.
I grew up about 15-20 minutes from Newark. So,
Okay.
But the truth is I was making good money as a trainer. I was pretty blessed. I had a good career, and I didn't have any commitments. I wasn't married. I didn't have kids. And I was kind of a minimalist. I still am kind of a minimalist. So I didn't have a lot of stuff. So I had money. And so at one point I was like, you know what? Let me go check out this Canyon Ranch place, right?
Yeah.
And it's one of these places where like every meal is, organic and like alfalfa sprouts and,
Yeah.
and whatever. But they had a great gym that had both a sauna and a cold pool, which was awesome. They had like, yoga classes every day and equestrian and all kinds of, but they had all these motivational, mental healthy kinds of quotes stenciled on the walls.
Yeah.
And they had one in one of the hallways, just sticks with me all the time. And it said, happiness is not getting what you want. Happiness is wanting what you have.
Mm. That's a great, yeah. Just it goes back to what you said about contentment.
Right.
At some point,
Right.
especially when you're young, I think you chase and chase and chase and chase. And then at what point do you say, like, look at my life, And that's where I'm at. It's like, I've got a great wife, an awesome kid, a good career that provides for my family. I've got my health, which is huge, and I've got something that fulfills me, So at some point you would think, or you would hope, that everybody gets to a point where they're like, okay, I've chased this goal this entire time.
Yeah.
Now I'm there, you know what I mean? So I just need to
Right.
appreciate the stage of life that I'm in.
Right.
And kind of going back to what I was saying, I don't think, maybe struggle is not even the word.
Right.
I think what it really is challenges, ways to challenge yourself, and that could be running a marathon or doing jujitsu or whatever. But once you hit that stage, especially going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where I've got a roof over my head, I've got food and water, I've got a career that provides for me.
Yeah.
Now I'm kind of in that self-fulfillment stage. So how do I fulfill myself?
Yeah. And so what I want to do is because I want to be mindful of our time, and I recognize that we're starting to run a little bit long, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie in. So for those who are on my in my Facebook groups, I have a couple of Facebook groups.
Yep.
We talk about sort of the tools for growth and thriving, and some of those come up repeatedly. And if you've listened to the podcast, you've certainly heard some of these things come up repeatedly. And what's interesting in talking to you for the past hour or so, John, is that I've heard like you're not, you're clearly not, and never claimed to be sort of academic about this kind of stuff. You're like, right. And so, but I've heard you describe how you exercise each of these skills that I talk about. And these are the skills. What's amazing is that when, or fascinating to me anyway, is that when researchers look at those people who do achieve like growth and thriving after adversity, what they call post-traumatic growth, there's a handful of abilities or skills that come up consistently as like, these are the things that propel people in that direction. And you've managed to sort of like cultivate all of them in yourself without maybe necessarily knowing that this is what you were doing.
Right.
So
yeah, I definitely didn't know that was what I was doing. Now that you
yeah,
that.
Right. So some of the things are like the growth mindset, right? And growth mindset is juxtaposed with a fixed mindset. The growth mindset is really a willingness to be a beginner and to have your vulnerabilities and weaknesses on display, right? And to just have a student's mindset and be willing to try new things and experiment, and in the interest of growing your ability and learning, right? Be on a white belt and go into jujitsu, or going and deciding to try rock climbing, even though you've never done it before, but learning. And so a lot of people avoid that because they don't want to look silly. They don't want to look dumb. But so the growth mindset is a big one. And you've talked about your willingness to learn, to challenge yourself, to embrace challenges. Gratitude. It's a little bit cliche, but Brene Brown, right? Everybody knows who Brene Brown is. She, in her studies and her research, she found that the primary difference between people who live with sort of a heavy sense of shame and people who live what she calls wholehearted, meaning without, like, free of shame, is that the people who live wholehearted, the only difference she could find, seriously, the only one, is that they have a purposeful, intentional gratitude practice. She also talks a lot about vulnerability and authenticity, which you talk about, like being able to come home and talk to your wife about things at work, and then there's Dr. Kristen Neff is the primary name in what we call radical self-compassion. And the interesting thing with self-compassion is we find that people who, for example, have a failure and treat themselves with compassion actually go back and work harder than the people who are very self-critical. So for people who avoid self-compassion because they say, oh, I don't want to lose my edge, or it's going to make me weak or soft, you actually end up performing better. And you've talked about, like, in parenting and on the fire service, like just being able to cut yourself some slack when things don't go well. And and mindfulness is, that being in the present and recognizing what's here and now, and recognizing the past as the past and the future as potential, hasn't come yet, but living in the present. And so these are the handful of skills that over and over again lead people out of despair and into growth and thriving. And you've done a really great job without unintentionally illustrating.
Well, that's cool. Thank you. I appreciate that.
I appreciate it too.
So cool. Awesome.
Yeah. So listen, before we wrap up, why don't you, any points, any important things you feel like I didn't ask you about or that you wanted to bring up?
No, I think you pretty much hit on everything. I was kind of an open book for this, so
Yeah,
just along for
great.
the ride. So yeah, no, I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
And why don't you talk to people about where to find the Mentor podcast? Because that's worth listening to.
Okay, yeah. So we're mainly on Spotify. We are on Google Podcasts as well. If you go to Spotify and just type in the Mentor Podcast, you'll see our logo. It's a triangle with an M in the middle. And
Mhm.
then we do have a Facebook page, which is Mentor Podcast. And then we have a Instagram as well, Mentor Podcast CO. And like I talked about, we plan on getting you on there soon as well. We've got a list of like 15 or 20 people we want to interview. So
I'd love to do it. I'd love to.
yeah, yeah.
So
Once I get done with the COVID, we'll get you on.
for sure. Please feel better
Yeah.
soon. So yeah. So if you
Thank you.
haven't checked
Appreciate
out the
that.
Mentor, yeah, definitely. I went through it myself and it was lousy. So I hope you have an easier experience.
Yeah.
Um, for those
Yeah.
who have not
It's not
checked
too
out,
bad so far.
good, yeah. If you've not checked out the Mentor podcast, please do. It's definitely worth a listen. It's I've gotten great value out of each and every episode. I listen to podcasts while I'm in the gym, and
Oh, awesome.
yeah, and Mentor podcast is exceptionally good.
Thank you.
It really is. It's a really well conceived idea, and it's executed well. So definitely
Awesome.
check it out.
Thank you very much.
For sure. I definitely want to thank everyone for either listening or watching this podcast. And I'd like to encourage you to like, subscribe, and share. Please share it with your friends. If you want to find me or ask me any questions, reach out to me in any kind of way. I have 3 groups on Facebook. One is Growth and Thriving After Trauma. One is Thriving Fathers Parenting After Trauma. And the last is Leadership Skills for Survivors. I also have a YouTube channel for this podcast, and the channel is Growth and Thriving LLC. Growth and with an ampersand, Growth and Thriving LLC. The podcast, the audio version is available through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. And just recently, I started a blog, which is looking at my life, and it's a little more lighthearted, a little funnier, but still looking at a lot of the mistakes I've made, lessons I've learned, and inviting other people to kind of jump in and share their lives in the comments. But the podcast is called, or I'm sorry, the blog is called "What the Fuck Am I Doing?" and the website for it is whatthefkamidoing.com. So please check that out and let me know what you think. And thanks again, everybody, so much for listening. Have a happy and a healthy new year. And Dr. Jerry Sunshine Novak signing off, and just say, keep growing until you're thriving.